Okay, so it's part 2 of making your pinch pot bowl. So you should have your bowl in progress. I'm gonna take out my bowl from earlier. So I've got a bowl and I've got my ball of clay that's for my second project in this case. You'll need that kind of handy because you're gonna spill a little clay off of it, but I'm gonna set it aside for right now. And anything that you need to do to complete this piece. My bag was a little dirty, so I have a little material on there, but basically day 1 in the case of what we were doing in class time was really making this full pinch pot shape and spending some time on that. Not to say that you can get it done in 1 day or 1 hour. It will take you a little bit of time, but thinking through, looking at your worksheet, what direction you want to go, starting out with a pretty kind of generic, just U-shaped form, and then as you continue to work, if you want something that has a little more of a flat base, you're going to get your fingers on the inside and sort of do a pushing motion to the corner, and your hand is below so that you can feel the pressure as you're pulling on that clay, compressing it, but also kind of forcing it in a specific direction so you can get a little bit more of a flat base on your bowl versus sitting and tamping it down, which is not what you want to do. You want to actually shape it into that form. And you want your walls to be fairly evenly thick from top to bottom and even through the base. So the thickness here should be pretty much the same thickness as what you feel all the way through the pot. Sometimes that's very difficult to kind of know how thick it is. If you were in the classroom, you could use a needle tool. Also, sometimes online you see people refer to them as pin tools. And if you have a tool like that, you could hold the wall of your piece and push the needle through until you just feel it on the other side, and then hold the needle and pull that out and measure the thickness and see if you're even with the rim or not. And you're not trying to get paper thin. I don't want you to be so thin that your piece is super fragile and cracking and making you crazy. Since I can't assume that anybody has a needle tool or something kind of like that at home, another way to measure, if you happen to have a little push pin at home, you could do the same thing because it's metal, it's very thin. You kind of push through the wall until you just feel that it touches through on my finger on the inside, not going fast, not trying to draw blood. And then this time I kind of have to visually keep an idea of how much of the wire basically I can still see there, or the metal, and then approximate it against the rim. Again, don't need to do that step, but sometimes it's very hard to feel the actual thickness. It feels very thin, and in reality you still have quite a bit of clay that you can move there, so you can get a larger Teabowl, or you have more ability to move the material out into a shape that you like. Okay, I'm gonna be satisfied with this shape. It's kind of like the Momogata, so it has a little bit of a peach sort of shape. It has a little bend in it. As I bend this here, my rim is getting pretty dry. So one of the troubleshooting things that we talked about today was that if you're getting cracks along the rim of your piece and it's getting pretty firm and dry, so you can dip your finger in a little bit of water and do a little water massage to fix small little cracks and fissures. But if you've got something a little bit bigger or a little bit drier and it's really being stubborn to go away, you don't want to just kind of cover it up with a little wet clay. Instead, if I had a big crack here, make one in my piece. So I got a crack now, and now I'm going to stab at it and scratch up the surface of this rim pretty good with my bamboo skewer here. And you saw I put a little bit of water on it to start, or you can kind of break it open and put a little water on it. And basically I'm making a whole big mess out of this part, and that's okay, because what I'm doing is I'm rehydrating that clay. I'm getting it soft and opening it up even further than it was with the crack that was there. And then I'm gonna come back and start to pinch and compress and push that clay back together. So those kind of cracks generally happen because your piece is getting a lot of air. So if you've been working on it for a little while and you feel like the rim in particular is getting really dry, but you still have things to do in the base or the form, you can put a little water just rub a little bit of water, nothing that's dripping down the sides. I don't want massive amounts of water because that can actually weaken your piece. But a little bit of water on the rim, and then you can slide it back in the bag and let it rest for, I don't know, maybe 30 minutes or so. And then come back to it and keep on working it, and that water should have kind of absorbed and rehydrated into your bowl. The other thing that you want to consider is once you do get your form where you want it, you're happy with it, you want to soften this rim up a little bit. Or if you have a whole like roller coaster ride going around the top of your piece and you want it more level, you can turn the piece over, tamp it down on the flat surface fairly lightly. I'm not whacking on it, I'm not slamming into it. And then I'm gonna see places that get flat from just tapping it on the tabletop. And I like to roll that clay back down into the side of the bowl because my sides are fairly thin. So I'm just grabbing that edge and pushing it back down in. And if I do that, back and forth, I can get a fairly even rim. For me, that's not a super big deal. I actually kind of like a wonky rim on a handmade piece like this. Just sort of depends on what you're going to use it for. And again, whether you're a perfectionist and you need it to be absolutely flat, then you're going to spend a little time doing this. Okay? Once you get your form complete, your rim's pretty clean where you want it to be, your shape is pretty much where you want it, then we've got to jump in and do our foot rings. So the foot rings are really important. They will change the look of your piece from being a little simple piece to something that's kind of elegant and lifted off, especially if you do sort of a taller foot ring. If you do a shorter foot ring, it just finishes the piece, as well as your bowl now sits flat and it isn't tipping all over the place. Whereas this piece is tipping all over the place, really wobbly. So I want my piece to sit flat and even so that I can put liquids in it and not worry about anything pouring out. So choosing your design, I'm gonna start out with the most basic one and the one that actually you can alter to be like many of these forms, which is a simple round foot ring. So some of you don't have a tabletop like I'm working on right here. So I'm gonna show you how to do it kind of out in space. But if you do have a tabletop that you can use just for a small amount of clay, that is a good idea, if you've got it. So you don't need a whole lot of clay to make your foot ring. Something kind of like an oversized marble or a kumquat, if you're familiar with that fruit. Trying to figure out ways for you to know how much clay to start with. It's a little, like an inch to an inch and a half size ball of clay. So not a ton of clay. And whatever you don't end up using, you're gonna put right back in your bag, so don't worry about wasting anything. So I'm gonna move a few things out of the way. First, if you don't have a table, you're gonna roll this ball of clay between your hands and create a coil. It is a little tricky to make a nice even coil in your hands, so spend a little time doing that. If it gets flat and on one side and round on the other, you can give it a little twist and then roll it again in your hands. And I end up sort of using one hand as my table and using my other hand as my roller. I'm just trying to make the most of the space that I have, or you can kind of roll up and down between your hands. But what I find is if you do a whole lot of that, that's what you're gonna have. The piece weakens because you're really putting a lot of pressure on it, a lot of friction and the air and the twisting that's going on. So you don't need a whole lot, but you do need a little ring, something that you can bring together and make into a little donut of clay that's gonna fit on your piece. This is too small for this piece. That would be a teeny tiny little foot ring and would make the pot a little tippy because it's as large as it is. So if I go back to that piece of clay again, if you can't wedge, you kind of finger wedge, just scrunching that clay across. And rolling that out. I need something that's a few inches long. Again, let's see what I've got as a minimum. 5 inches there. Totally depends on the size of your bowl and what you want for your foot ring in the end. bump in the middle, so work that out a little bit. But that's a little bit better. Okay, fits my bowl size a little bit better, so you want to think about that when you're considering how big to make your foot ring. So that's one way to shape your foot ring. The other is obviously to use a tabletop, same kind of method. But when you're rolling on a tabletop, it'll move a lot faster. The clay tends to not get as dry. And the key is to use your whole hand when rolling coils, or at least the length of your fingers. Not doing this. If you do lots of this, your clay will get really dry really fast, and you tend to over roll in one area and then get a thin spot, which is a little bit harder to work out or bring back together again. But I'm gonna bring it back together. That's the trick, is to kind of roll it back to the center, forcing that clay up. And then I've fixed my coil. So there we go. Either way. Again, I'm gonna lay it out on my bowl. You might be able to see my bowl has sort of a slant. So I'm gonna think about that as I'm putting my foot ring on, and I will be able to adjust that. I don't wanna put my foot ring on so that I'm trying to blend these two ends together, because quite frankly, they don't match. Thick and thin and uneven size. So I like to overlap my coil, and then I'm gonna use my craft stick here and cut through both coils so you can see what I just did, and then remove your scraps. And now I'm gonna have a ring that fits up against itself really well, so I can close those ends. But I'm nowhere near done yet, because I've got to attach this to my bowl. And if I stick this on really hard, right now this clay all has water on it and feels like it's attached. But this is literally gonna drop right off as the clay starts to dry. So I have to do something called slipping and scoring in order to attach my two pieces of clay to one another, because this is more dry and this is more wet. And neither is really wet enough to just blend the two together. So I'm gonna use my bamboo skewer and draw an outline around my foot ring and then set it aside. And now I'm gonna do what's called scoring, which means that I am making marks, deep marks, into the surface of my piece, just like I'm scoring a game. Like you would make 4 little marks and then cross them for your 5th score. Here we are just scoring all the way around, really roughing up this surface. And hopefully you're seeing what I mean by that. I want clay to lift off and little bits and pieces almost ready to fall off of the piece, and then deep marks. I don't want to go through the wall, so be careful not to just start poking holes in your bowl, but you do want to rough up this surface and really create some texture there. And don't worry about making a mess. It's all going to get cleaned up and disappear later. So that's my scoring. My scoring is not what I see students do, where they make nice little lines and crosshatch and then they think that's scoring. That's decorating. So see the difference between this being still smooth and this being all rough and craggly. So this I can just wipe off. I don't want that. I want this, where I can't just wipe it off. The clay is nice and loose though, so it will smooth out really easily. So that's scoring, and it's on your vocabulary sheet here. Second one up from the bottom, score and slip. So we are doing scoring, which means, again, to mark up, rough up the surface. Then I'm going to create some slip by grabbing some water and sort of dripping it right on to the spot that I scored. I don't want to add so much water that it's pouring down the side of my piece. I'm not trying to do that, but I want to get this wet, and then I'm going to score again. And what I'm doing is I'm softening that clay up and getting it nice and gooey, because slip, S-L-I-P, is liquefied clay. That's what it literally is. Sometimes ceramic artists will make a bowl of slip, and that's what they just kind of dip into and use as their glue. But in this case, we're creating the slip with a little bit of water, because that's pretty easy. And you can see it's like this gooey stuff. So this is the glue that's going to help hold your two pieces together. Okay, so scoring, slipping, and then in reality scoring again in order to create that goop that's on there. Because what we're doing, like I said, if you just put this ring on there and stuck it onto your piece initially, you're trying to do this, and they'll just pop apart as the water evaporates. Instead, we're roughing up the surface, and my ring here is soft enough that I can get away with kind of having it be semi-solid, but we're forcing these two pieces of clay together, and then that tightens down so that even when the water evaporates, the clay will stay in one piece. So you could score up the backside of your coil. Generally, your coil is so soft that you kind of get away without having to score that side in this piece. So you can see my mess here. So the part I really want you to notice is my next step is to press this foot ring onto my bowl, and I do it by pinching over the top of the coil and pushing down. And I'm pushing down enough so that that slip is kind of squishing out as I go. And I'm not just mashing the whole ring on, because I actually want my foot ring to stay a nice three-dimensional form that's stuck to the bottom of my piece. So I'm pressing it in all the way around. I can blend and get rid of that little join mark. And now my ring is pretty well attached, but not entirely, because I have the seam on the outside and on the inside I need to clean up. And this is a structural thing, not just the way that I like it to look. So you can use the edge of your finger and literally wipe the clay down onto the surface, and you can see it just smooths right into the wall of the bowl. Sometimes the slip is wet enough and my finger is big enough that it gets a little hard to control and I get slippery, so I might use the edge of my tool, in this case my craft knife, craft stick, and I blend, just grabbing the edge of that clay, not much, because again, I don't want to destroy my foot ring. I want it to still keep that form. And I just work my way around the piece. Not worrying about making it too pretty right now. This is really structural. Okay, so I've gone all the way around. I can go and do some cleanup, but I'm gonna wait until after I do the interior. Because the same thing, I have a seam there. That's a place for air to be and just a separation between the clay, and I don't want that. So I'm gonna use my tool. Again, you could use your finger, especially if you don't have a fingernail that's long. But just grab the very edge of that coil and push it down and seal up that seam. And I'm using enough pressure that I'm really filling that seam as I'm smoothing it out. I'm not trying to pull something across and creating an air bubble in the middle. Okay? So now I'm all nice and tight. My foot ring is attached. I can hold my piece by that because it's nice and strong. It's basically all one now. And then I can go through and start doing all my cleanup. You can use the craft stick if you want to and do your smoothing, or your fingers. You don't want to oversaturate this with water, so I would resist the urge to jump into a bunch of water. But you can get this nice and cleaned up. And then my coil is really soft, so at this point, if I turn it over, I'm checking to see if it's sitting flat or if it still has a little wobble. I can tamp it down again gently. Look for places where it's flat versus places that aren't touching the table. And I can either pinch a little bit to make it a little bit taller, or I can roll that edge kind of down onto the wall of the bowl to bring it down in height if needed. So you can make some adjustments to the foot ring and how evenly your bowl sits, but you can see my bowl is now gonna return to sitting flat because it has a nice solid foot ring on it. So that's how you attach it. Almost any way that you make a foot ring, you want to attach it so it's well adhered to it. You can leave it like this so that your foot ring is kind of smooth and blends into the side of your piece, or you can create an edge on there if you want to, create a line. So there's a distinction between the bowl and the foot ring itself. That's very much a design choice. You can also press and create designs not only in the side of your piece, but in the foot ring itself. So if I wanted to create a pattern that went around the piece, I could do that with my tools there.